6 years. For 6 long years, the most feared mafia boss in Seoul had not slept through a single night. Doctors tried everything. Medicine, therapy, even experimental treatments. Nothing worked. Every night at exactly 12:30 a.m., Taeyong Park would wake up from the same nightmare. The memory of the night his wife died protecting him. His mansion became a prison of silence. Servants quit within days. Maids refused to stay. No one could stand the cold look in his eyes. Until one day. His aunt brought in a new maid. A quiet girl from Jeju Island. She didn't fear him. She didn't avoid him. And somehow, on the very first night she arrived, the man who hadn't slept for 6 years finally closed his eyes. But when the doctor and his aunt rushed into his room the next morning, what they saw on that bed left them completely speechless. Welcome back to the shadows. Today we're heading to the heart of Seoul, where power and pain walk hand in hand. Imagine having everything the world can offer, but being unable to sleep for 6 long years. This is the story of Taeyong Park, the silent dragon, and the one girl who dared to enter his cage. Let's dive into the mafia boss and the maid. The outside world, Taeyong Park was the silent dragon, a man whose very name caused the neon lights of Gangnam to flicker with a predatory chill. By day, he moved through the glass and steel corridors of his corporate headquarters like a god carved from obsidian. He sat at the head of mahogany boardrooms, his presence so heavy that seasoned CEOs struggled to draw breath. With a single, silent nod, he moved millions of dollars across borders. With a slight narrowing of his eyes, he dismantled rival organizations that had taken decades to build. He was the undisputed king of the Seoul underground, a figure of absolute, terrifying authority who navigated the treacherous waters of power without ever showing a hint of exhaustion. His suits were custom-tailored armor, his expressions were iron masks, and his voice never rose above a calm, lethal whisper. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, bleeding crimson over the Han River, the silent dragon began to shrink. When the heavy armored doors of his penthouse clicked shut, the king was stripped of his crown. The transition was agonizingly slow. He would stand at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his living room, watching the city pulse with life below him. Millions of souls were preparing to rest, to drift into the sweet oblivion of sleep, while Taeyong remained an outsider to humanity's most basic comfort. He would wander through his vast, echoing hallways, his footsteps absorbed by expensive Persian rugs that felt like sinking sand. Every piece of art on the walls, the gold leaf sculptures, the minimalist paintings, the crystal chandeliers that dripped like frozen tears, was a reminder of what he had gained in exchange for his soul. By 11:00 p.m., the tremors would usually start. It began in his hands, the very hands that had once held the warm, vibrant life of his wife, Soo-jin. He would retreat to his master bedroom, a space of white marble and $10,000 Italian linens that felt more like a tomb than a sanctuary. The room was designed for ultimate peace, yet it was the most violent place in his world. Taeyong would lie flat on his back, his body perfectly still, staring up at the ceiling as if waiting for a sentence to be carried out. He was a prisoner in a palace of gold, surrounded by every luxury imaginable, yet he would have traded it all for a single hour of dreamless quiet. His eyes would fixate on the digital clock on his nightstand. The red numbers burned into his retinas, ticking down with the precision of a time bomb. 12:15, 12:20, 12:25. The air in the room grew thick, smelling of expensive cologne and the metallic scent of old fear. His heartbeat would accelerate, thumping against his ribs like a trapped bird. He would try to breathe, to count, to listen to the white noise machine his doctor had insisted on, but all he could hear was the impending silence of the street outside. 12:29. Taeyong froze. He stopped breathing. He didn't even bother closing his eyes because he already knew the rhythm of his own destruction. Then, right on time, as the clock flipped to 12:30 a.m., the world fractured. It wasn't just a memory, it was a physical assault. A phantom gunshot, sharp, loud, and final, detonated in the center of his brain. His eyes snapped wide, alert, and bloodshot, as if someone had screamed a secret directly into his ear. His body would jolt, his muscles locking in a reflex of failed protection. For a split second, he would feel the phantom warmth of blood soaking through his shirt, the weight of a dying woman leaning into his chest, and the smell of rain on a dark Seoul street. Taeyong groaned, a low, guttural sound of defeat, and fell back against the pillows. His forehead was slick with a cold sweat that no air conditioning could dry. He looked at the clock again. 12:31 a.m. The nightmare was over for the night, but the wakefulness was just beginning. He would spend the next 5 hours staring at the shadows on the wall, a billionaire with the eyes of a dead man, waiting for the sun to rise so he could put on his suit and become the dragon once more. He was a man who owned the city, yet he was owned by a single minute in time. He was rich enough to buy 3 countries, but he was too poor to buy rest. In the silence of his golden cage, Tiong Park was not a boss, a leader, or a legend. He was simply a man drowning in a sea of gold, waiting for someone, anyone, to pull him to the shore. The rain in Seoul that night did not fall. It descended like a heavy, suffocating curtain of liquid lead. It was the kind of night where the neon signs of the city bled into the asphalt, turning the streets into a kaleidoscope of shattered glass and broken light. Tiong remembered the smell most of all, a mixture of expensive ozone from the charity gala they had just stepped out of and the cold, metallic scent of wet pavement. He had been smiling. It was a rare, genuine expression that only Soo-jin could coax out of his ironclad features. She was wrapped in a dress of shimmering silk that looked like captured moonlight, her arm linked firmly in his as they moved toward the idling black sedan. "You're brooding again, Tiong," she had teased, her voice a melody that cut through the rhythmic drumming of the downpour. He had looked down at her, the most powerful man in the underground feeling suddenly small under her perceptive gaze. He had murmured something about the security perimeter, about the rivals who circled his empire like starving wolves, but she had stopped him with a gentle hand on his cheek. Her skin was warm, a stark contrast to the biting autumn air. "Then promise me something," she said, her eyes searching his. "No matter how powerful you become, no matter how many dragons you have to slay, don't lose the man who still worries about me. Don't let the boss kill the husband." He had nodded, a silent vow sealed in the rain. "I promise," he whispered, but promises in their world were fragile things, easily crushed by the weight of a lead slug. The transition from peace to horror happened in the space between 2 heartbeats. The sound wasn't a roar, it was a sharp, clinical crack that punctuated the rain. Tiong's instincts, honed by years of violence, screamed for him to move, to shield, to strike, but he was a fraction of a second too slow. Soo-jin, ever the sunlight to his shadow, had sensed the danger before it fully formed. She didn't scream. She didn't hesitate. She simply stepped into the path of the trajectory meant for his heart. The impact threw her back into his arms. For a heartbeat, Tiong thought she had tripped, but then the warmth began to spread, a terrifying, pulsing heat that soaked into his custom-tailored suit. The shimmering silk of her dress turned a dark, bruised purple as the life drained out of her and into the gutter. He collapsed to his knees on the wet asphalt, cradling her as his bodyguards swarmed the perimeter, their shouts sounding like they were underwater. He didn't care about the shooter. He didn't care about the war he knew was starting. He only cared about the way her fingers gripped his coat, her strength fatting with every drop of rain. "Tiong," she gasped, her voice barely a thread. He pressed his forehead against hers, his tears mixing with the rainwater on her face. "Stay with me," he begged, a king reduced to a beggar. "Soo-jin, please, I promised." Her eyes, once so full of defiant kindness, began to cloud. Her last effort was a ghost of a smile, a final flicker of the light before the darkness claimed her. "Keep living," she whispered, her hand slipping from his collar to hit the pavement with a sickening, hollow thud. The aftermath was a blur of cold steel and white noise. The police, the sirens, the frantic calls from his lieutenants, it all passed through him like he was a ghost. He found himself in the back of a different car, staring down at his hands. They were stained a deep, indelible crimson. He took a silk handkerchief, a gift she had bought him for their anniversary, and began to wipe the blood away. He scrubbed until his skin was raw, until the red was gone from his fingernails and his palms, but it was a useless ritual. He could wash away the physical evidence, but the weight of her body stayed in his arms. The heat of her blood stayed on his chest. When he finally returned to the penthouse that night, the silence of the mansion was deafening. It was the birth of the monster the world would eventually come to fear. The warm man who had stood on that balcony promising to stay human had died on that sidewalk alongside his wife. What walked into that master bedroom was a hollow shell, a machine fueled by a singular, cold purpose. He had kept his promise to keep living, but he had failed the promise to keep his soul. He sat on the edge of the bed, the same bed where they had once whispered dreams of a life away from the shadows, and watched the clock. It was 12:30. The rain continued to lash against the glass, a persistent reminder of the night his world broke. He realized then that he would never be clean again. The blood was gone from his skin, but the guilt was stitched into his very marrow. He had been saved by the one person he was supposed to protect, and in the economy of the underworld, that was a debt he could never repay. As the first 12:30 a.m. passed in a haze of grief, Tiong Park understood his true sentence. He was destined to live, but he was never allowed to rest. The shattered promise was now his only companion, a jagged piece of glass embedded in his heart that would twist every time he tried to close his eyes. By the 6th year of his vigil, Tiong Park had become a myth wrapped in a suit of armor. The untouchable boss moved through the corridors of power with a stillness that was more terrifying than rage. He was a master of the frozen moment, a man who could command an empire without blinking, yet his own body was beginning to mutiny against the silence. In the clinical privacy of his study, the air smelled of bitter tea and the ozone of high-end medical equipment. Dr. Kang Minyi, a man who had stitched up bullet wounds on the docks of Busan and survived the fiercest gang wars, now stood before Tiong with a hand that trembled ever so slightly. He held the latest scan of Tiong's heart like it was a death warrant. "It is not a bullet that will kill you, Tiong," the doctor said, his voice strained with a decade of shared secrets. "It is the exhaustion. Your heart is a muscle, and you are starving it of the only thing that repairs it. You are running a Ferrari on an empty tank, and the engine is beginning to seize." Tiong didn't look up from the ledger on his desk. His face was a pale mask of exhaustion, his eyes sunken into dark hollows that made him look a century old. "Then give me stronger sedatives, Kang," he replied, his voice a dry rasp. The doctor shook his head, a gesture of desperate finality. "There is no chemical fix for a haunting. Your heart is failing because your mind refuses to let it rest. If you don't sleep, really sleep, within the next month you won't be ruling soul. You'll be buried beneath it." The heavy mahogany door to the study swung open without a knock, a breach of protocol that would have resulted in a disappearance for anyone else. Aunt Sunhee swept in, her presence a whirlwind of traditional silk and unapologetic authority. She was the only person left who remembered the boy who had once chased goats in the countryside, and she was the only one who didn't fear the dragon. She looked at the doctor, then at her nephew, her lips thinning into a line of stubborn determination. "Kang is right," she declared, ignoring the lethal coldness in Tiong's gaze. "This house is not a home, it is a morgue. The staff moves like ghosts because they are terrified of joining you in the grave. You need more than medicine. You need a soul that can handle the cold." Tiong finally looked up, a flick of annoyance crossing his features. "I don't need another maid to quit by breakfast, Aunt. The last one fainted just because I entered the kitchen." Sunhee leaned over the desk, her eyes flashing with a fierce, protective light. "The others were looking for a paycheck. This one, she has seen her own shadows. I found her on Jeju, working in a guest house where the wind howls loud enough to drive a man mad, yet she walked through it with a smile. She isn't afraid of your silence, Tiong, because she carries her own peace." Tiong sighed, the weight of his 6-year fatigue pressing down on his shoulders like a leaden shroud. "Do whatever you want, just keep her out of my sight." The following morning, the atmosphere in the mansion shifted. The housekeepers and security details stood in the foyer, their movements stiff and their whispers hushed as they watched the front entrance. They called this place the Lion's Den, a fortress where the sun never seemed to fully penetrate the tinted glass. When the heavy doors finally opened, they expected a trembling girl or a stern, elderly housekeeper. Instead, Amara Akoy walked into the light. She was a vision of jarring, beautiful contrast. Her dark brown skin glowed against the stark, clinical white of the marble foyer, and her natural afro was styled with a simple, practical elegance. While the rest of the staff wore expressions of perpetual anxiety, Amara carried a quiet, grounded presence that seemed to push back against the mansion's suffocating chill. She carried a single, modest suitcase, and as she looked around the cathedral-like space, her eyes didn't widen in fear or greed. She simply observed. One of the senior maids stepped forward, her voice a frantic whisper. "You must be very careful. Do not look him in the eye. Do not speak unless spoken to. The boss, he is not like other men." Amara didn't flinch. Instead, she offered a small, serene smile that seemed to catch the staff off guard. It was the first genuine smile the Lion's Den had seen in years. "I have handled difficult storms before," she said, her Korean fluent and softened by a gentle, melodic lilt. "A man is only as dangerous as the secrets he keeps from himself." As she was led toward the servants' quarters, she passed the grand staircase. High above, standing in the shadows of the second-floor gallery, Tiong Park watched her. He was a silhouette of sharp angles and cold intent, his gaze fixed on the back of her head like a predator marking its prey. He expected to see her shoulders tense, to see the telltale stumble of someone realizing they had stepped into a trap. But Amara didn't stumble. She paused at the foot of the stairs, and as if sensing the heavy weight of his eyes, she turned. She didn't bow in terror. She didn't look away. She simply looked up at the most feared man in Seoul and gave a polite, measured nod of acknowledgement. In that moment, the silent dragon felt a strange, localized flicker of warmth in his chest, a sensation so foreign he almost mistook it for pain. The girl from Jeju had arrived, and for the first time in 6 years, the air in the golden cage felt like it might actually be thin enough to breathe. The first evening of Amara's arrival, the mansion felt as though it were holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion that occurred whenever a new soul collided with the orbit of Tiong Park. The air was thick with the scent of floor wax and the low, electric hum of the security system. Tiong did not go to the kitchen to meet her. He waited in the library, a room of dark oak and shadows where the only light came from the flickering embers in the fireplace. He wanted her to feel the weight of the house before she ever felt the weight of his presence. He wanted the silence to do the heavy lifting of intimidation for him. When the soft knock finally came, it was rhythmic and steady, not the frantic, hesitant tapping he was used to. Amara entered with a tray of evening tea, her movements fluid and purposeful. Tiong didn't move from his position by the window, his back to her, a silhouette of sharp, unforgiving lines against the twilight of Seoul. He remained silent for a long minute, letting the tension coil in the room like a spring. To any other servant, this silence was a physical blow, a message that they were insignificant. But behind him, he heard only the soft clink of china as she set the tray on the low table. "Your tea, sir," she said. Her voice was a calm, resonant contrast to the graveyard quiet of the room. "It's a blend from the southern coast. It's good for the nerves when the wind turns cold." Tiong turned slowly, his coat draped over his shoulders like a cape. His dark eyes narrowing into the predatory gaze that had brought captains of industry to their knees. He moved toward her, not with a walk, but with a prowl. He was night personified, dark, vast, and cold. He stopped only inches away from her, looming over her petite frame until his shadow completely swallowed her. He expected her to tremble. He expected her to drop her gaze to his polished leather shoes. He wanted to see the flicker of a trapped bird in her eyes. Instead, Amara looked up. Her dark brown skin seemed to catch the dying light of the fire, making her look as though she were carved from warm earth. She didn't flinch at his proximity, she didn't even blink. To her, he wasn't a legend or a monster, he was simply a man standing too close. As they stood there, the contrast was jarring. Tiong was the embodiment of the city's winter, sharp, artificial, and frozen in time. Amara was the dawn, natural, inevitable, and carrying the promise of warmth. He leaned down, his voice a low, lethal vibration. "Do you know who I am, girl? Do you know what happens to people who stay in this house too long?" Amara studied him for a moment, her expression one of quiet, almost clinical observation. She didn't answer with words at first. Instead, she did something that paralyzed the silent dragon. She reached out. Her fingers, steady and warm, brushed against the lapel of his silk pajama top. With a practiced, gentle motion, she reached up and adjusted his collar, smoothing out a small wrinkle he hadn't noticed. The touch was so domestic, so startlingly human, that Tiong actually forgot to breathe. It was a gesture of care, not submission. "I know that your collar is crooked," she said softly, her eyes meeting his with a depth of peace that felt like a challenge. "And I know that a man who spends all his time trying to look dangerous usually forgets how to be comfortable." She stepped back, her movements graceful as she performed a deep, traditional bow of respect. It wasn't the bow of a servant fearing a master. It was the bow of a guest acknowledging a host. "I am Amara. I am here to ensure this house functions, not to fear the person living in it. If you wish for me to leave, you only have to ask. But until then, the tea is getting cold." Tiong watched her as she straightened up. For the first time in 6 years, his internal monologue, usually a jagged loop of guilt and tactical calculations, faltered. He was used to being a nightmare that people tried to wake up from, but this girl looked at him as if she were the one who had just woken up and found him standing in the light. She didn't wait for his dismissal. She turned and walked toward the door, her footsteps light and unhurried. As she reached the threshold, she paused and looked back over her shoulder. The 12:30 hour is approaching, Mr. Park. You should drink the tea before then. It won't stop the memory, but it might make the waking a bit softer. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Tiang alone in the darkening library. He looked down at his collar, the place where her fingers had touched him still feeling a strange, lingering warmth. He looked at the steaming cup of tea, the scent of wildflowers and sea salt rising from it. He was the knight, the undisputed king of shadows, but for a single, terrifying moment, the dawn had looked him in the face and refused to blink. He realized then that Aunt Sunhee hadn't just hired a maid. She had smuggled a revolutionary into his fortress. And as he reached for the cup, his hand, for the first time in weeks, did not shake. The air inside the penthouse usually curdled as midnight approached, growing heavy with the static of a storm that never broke. Tiang sat in the dark of his master's suite, his eyes tracing the red glow of the digital clock as it bled into the shadows. 12:28, 12:29. The familiar, cold dread began to tighten its coil around his lungs. He knew the sequence by heart, the sudden drop in temperature, the phantom scent of rain on asphalt, and then the sound, that sharp, bone-shattering crack of a gunshot that lived inside his skull. Expecting the explosion, he stood up, his black silk pajamas rustling like dried leaves. He couldn't stay in the room tonight. The gold leaf moldings felt like they were closing in, a gilded ribcage intended to crush the life out of him. He moved through the hallways like a ghost haunting his own property, his bare feet silent on the cold marble. He expected the mansion to be a tomb, but as he approached the kitchen, a sliver of warm, amber light spilled across the floor. It was a soft, organic glow that stood in defiance of the sharp, clinical LEDs that usually illuminated his home. He paused at the threshold, his breath hitching. Amara was there. She wasn't cleaning or prepping for the morning. She was simply existing in the space. A small porcelain pot sat on the stove, emitting a gentle hiss of steam that smelled of earth, honey, and a hint of something bitter, like the wild herbs that clung to the cliffs of Jeju. Amara sat at the small breakfast table, her natural hair haloed by the light of a single lamp. She didn't jump when he appeared. She didn't even look surprised. She merely checked the time on the wall clock, 12:30 a.m., and then looked at him with eyes that held no pity, only a quiet, grounded recognition. "The shadow is late tonight," she said softly. Her voice wasn't a whisper. It was a low, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate against the silence of the room. Tiang leaned against the doorframe, his body braced for the gunshot that was supposed to have already happened. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic, uneven rhythm. "What are you doing up, Amara? It's past the hour for servants to be seen." "I am not waiting to be seen," she replied, rising from her chair with a grace that made the heavy atmosphere of the house feel lighter. "I am waiting for the water to reach the right temperature. A memory as heavy as yours cannot be fought with pills, Mr. Park. Chemical sleep is just a temporary death. You don't need to die to find rest. You just need to be reminded that the world is still turning outside of that one night." She poured the dark, amber liquid into a cup, a simple earthenware vessel that looked out of place among his crystal and silver. She stepped toward him, crossing the invisible boundary he had spent 6 years building around himself. She didn't offer him a pill or a glass of water to wash away the pain. She held out the cup, the steam rising between them like a veil. "Drink," she commanded. It wasn't the request of a maid, it was the instruction of a healer. "It is made from the roots of the island. They grow in the dark under the weight of the sea and the stone, yet they never forget the sun." Tiang looked down at the cup, then at her. For the first time in 2,190 days, the digital clock had passed the mark and the gunshot had not fired. The silence in his head was terrifying. It was a vacuum he didn't know how to fill. He took the cup, his fingers brushing against hers. Her skin was warm, startlingly, vibrantly warm. As he took a sip, the flavor was complex, blooming across his tongue with a heat that seemed to seep directly into his bones. Then she began to hum. It wasn't a song he recognized from the radio or the high-end lounges of Gangnam. It was a low, wordless melody, a rhythmic swaying of sound that mimicked the pull of the tide against the shore. It was the sound of the wind through the tall grass of Jeju, the sound of a mother's breath against a child's forehead. It was a sound that had no place in a mafia boss's penthouse, yet it filled the kitchen until the cold marble, and the steel appliances seemed to vanish. Tiang felt his shoulders drop. The tension that had been stitched into his muscles for 6 years began to unravel, one thread at a time. He slumped into the chair opposite hers, the cup still held tightly in his hands. He wanted to speak, to ask her how she was doing this, to demand to know what she had put in the tea, but his tongue felt heavy, and his eyelids were becoming leaden curtains. "The rain has stopped, Tiang," she whispered. It was the first time she had used his name without a title, and it sounded like a benediction. "The street is dry. You are not on the pavement anymore. You are home." He tried to protest, to tell her that he had to stay awake to guard the gates, to watch for the shadows, but her humming grew steadier, a physical anchor that pulled him down into the depths of a stillness he hadn't known since he was a boy. His head tilted back against the chair, the cup resting precariously on his lap until Amara gently took it from his failing grip. For the first time since the night Sujin died, the 12:30 mark came and went without a scream. The gunshot remained silent. The silent dragon didn't wake up in a cold sweat. He didn't claw at his chest, instead in the warm, herb-scented light of the kitchen, surrounded by the soft melody of a girl who didn't fear his darkness. Tiang Park finally closed his eyes and drifted into a sleep so deep it felt like a miracle. He had spent 6 years ruling an empire of noise, but in the presence of the girl from the island, he had finally found the courage to embrace the quiet. The morning sun did not break through the windows of the penthouse so much as it bled through the sheer silk curtains, casting long, pale fingers of light across the white marble floors. It was 7:30 a.m., an hour that usually found Tiang Park sitting in his study, vibrating with the manic energy of a man who had survived another night in the trenches of his own mind. But today, the silence that gripped the mansion was different. It wasn't the suffocating, heavy silence of fear. It was a profound, hollow stillness that felt almost sacred. Dr. Kang Minyi arrived as he always did, his medical bag heavy with the sedatives he knew would be rejected, and the tonics he knew would go untasted. He moved with a practiced, weary efficiency, nodding to the head of security who stood outside the master's suite. Usually, by this time, the silent dragon was already dressed in a 3-piece suit, his mask of iron firmly in place. When the doctor found the bedroom door slightly ajar and the room empty, his heart stuttered. His mind immediately jumped to the worst, a collapse, an assassination, or a final, desperate break from reality. He moved toward the kitchen, the only place where a faint, golden glow still lingered. The sight that met Dr. Kang in the doorway caused him to freeze, his hand tightening so hard on the handle of his bag that the leather creaked. Aunt Sunhee was already there, standing just behind him, her hand pressed to her mouth in a gesture of pure, unadulterated shock. There, in the center of the domestic warmth, sat the most dangerous man in South Korea. He wasn't ruling an empire or demanding a head on a platter. Tiang Park was slumped in a simple wooden chair, his head resting heavily on the table atop his crossed arms. His black silk pajamas were rumpled, and his breathing was deep, rhythmic, and peaceful. It was a face Dr. Kang had not seen in 6 years, vulnerable, soft, and entirely human. Beside him, Amara sat perfectly still. She hadn't left his side. Her head was tilted back against the high-backed chair, her eyes closed in a light, protective doze, but her hand remained resting near Tiang's arm, as if she were a tether keeping him anchored to the earth. Dr. Kang didn't speak. He couldn't. He looked at the empty cup on the table, the faint scent of Jeju herbs still clinging to the air, and realized that a girl with a teapot had accomplished what 6 years of modern medicine and millions of dollars had failed to do. Tiang wasn't just unconscious, he was resting. The dragon was gone, replaced by a tired man who had finally been allowed to lay down his sword. Aunt Sunhee let out a jagged, watery breath, a single tear tracking through the elegant wrinkles of her cheek. She looked at Amara and saw not a maid, but a miracle. But while peace had finally found a home within the glass walls of the penthouse, the shadows of Seoul were lengthening. In a dimly lit private lounge in the heart of Gangnam, far removed from the quiet of the mansion, director Choi Min-seok sat enveloped in the thick, sweet haze of expensive cigars. He was a man of sharp angles and hidden depths, a lieutenant who had served Tiang with a smile that never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. Across from him sat 2 men whose tailored suits couldn't hide the jagged scars of the Busan docks, representatives of the Kims. a rival organization that had been waiting for a single crack in Tiang's armor. "The rumors are true, then?" the man from Busan asked, his voice a low growl. "The dragon hasn't been seen at the docks for 3 days. My men say the shipments are being handled by subordinates." Director Choi leaned forward, the amber light of his lighter reflecting in his eyes like a predatory spark. "It's worse than that," Choi whispered, a slow, toxic smirk spreading across his face. "He's found a distraction, a girl, a nobody from the islands. For 6 years he was a god because he never closed his eyes. He saw everything. He anticipated every move. But now, he's sleeping." Choi flicked a speck of ash from his sleeve, his voice dripping with a mixture of envy and newfound ambition. "A man who sleeps is a man who can be caught in a dream. He thinks he's finally found his peace, but all he's done is build himself a coffin out of silk and silence." He looked at the men from Busan, his expression hardening into something lethal. "The dragon is finally asleep, gentlemen, and while he's off in his dream world, we are going to make that sleep permanent. By the time he wakes up, there won't be an empire left for him to rule." Back in the mansion, Tiang shifted in his sleep, his hand twitching toward Amara, as if sensing a cold wind. Amara stirred, her eyes fluttering open, her gaze immediately landing on the man beside her. She didn't know about the meetings in Gangnam or the blood being promised in Busan. She only knew that the man who had been drowning was finally breathing. She reached out, her fingers gently smoothing a stray lock of black hair from his forehead. She knew the piece was fragile, a temporary bridge over a chasm of fire, but as she watched the silent dragon exhale a long, deep breath, she vowed that the world would have to go through her before they woke him up. The tired man had earned his dawn, and she would be the one to ensure the sun didn't set on him just yet. The peace that had settled over the mansion was not a sturdy thing. It was a thin pane of glass, beautiful and clear, but destined to shatter under the weight of the world Tiang Park had built. For 3 days, the silent dragon had moved with a strange, quiet grace, his eyes no longer bloodshot, his voice losing its jagged edge of irritation. But the underworld of Seoul did not tolerate soft edges. While Tiang sat in the garden with Amara, learning the names of the island plants she missed so dearly, the shadows were migrating toward his gates. The attack began not with a roar, but with a clinical silence. At 2:00 a.m., the perimeter sensors were bypassed by ghosts in tactical gear, professionals hired by Director Choi to ensure the dragon never woke again. Tiang was in his study, not staring at a clock, but reading a book Amara had left on his desk, when the first tremor of intuition hit him. It wasn't the phantom gunshot of his nightmare. It was the real, heavy silence of a house whose guards had been neutralized. He was across the room before the glass of the balcony shattered. 2 men swung in, suppressed weapons raised, but they were hunting a man they thought was tired and broken. They found instead a predator who had finally found something worth fighting for. Tiang didn't move with the cold, mechanical precision of a boss protecting his assets. He moved with a frantic, lethal desperation. He disarmed the first man with a brutal strike to the throat, using the assassin's own weapon to pin the second to the wall. His mind wasn't on his empire or his ledger. It was on the servants' quarters 3 floors down. "Amara," he roared, the name tearing from his throat with a raw power that shook the very foundation of the penthouse. He tore through the hallways, a whirlwind of black silk and violence. He found her in the kitchen, the same place where she had given him his first night of rest. 3 men had her cornered against the marble island. Amara wasn't screaming. She was holding a heavy cast-iron skillet, her eyes wide but her hands remarkably steady. When Tiang burst through the door, his eyes were not the eyes of a mafia boss. They were the eyes of a man seeing his entire world threatened for the second time. He didn't calculate the risk. He didn't wait for his backup. He threw himself into the fray, taking a shallow cut from a combat knife across his shoulder without a flinch. He fought like a man possessed, his protective instincts triggered by an emotion he had buried in the rain 6 years ago. This wasn't about power or territory. It was about the girl who had brought him tea in the dark. It was about the only person who had looked at him and seen a tired man instead of a monster. When the last of the intruders lay unconscious on the floor and the heavy thud of his security team's boots echoed in the hallway, Tiang didn't stand over his fallen enemies in triumph. He dropped the weapon in his hand and stumbled toward Amara. His breath came in jagged, painful hitches. He reached out, his hands trembling, not from the adrenaline of the fight, but from the terror of what he might have lost. "Are you hurt?" he gasped, his fingers grazing her arms, checking for wounds he couldn't see. Amara. Look at me, are you okay? Amara watched him, her chest heaving, the cast-iron pan finally slipping from her fingers to clang against the floor. She saw the blood on his shoulder, the wildness in his eyes, and the way he was shielding her with his entire body. She realized then that the dragon hadn't just woken up, he had grown a heart that could bleed. I'm here, Tiang, she whispered, stepping into his space, her warmth acting as a cooling balm to his fire. I'm okay. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving a hollow, ringing silence in the kitchen. The security team began to clear the bodies, their faces masks of shame for letting the breach happen. Tiang didn't look at them. He only looked at Amara. But as the tension broke, he noticed she was clutching something against her chest, a small, weathered envelope that looked out of place in the high-tech fortress. They weren't just here for me, she said, her voice dropping to a level only he could hear. They were looking for this, Choi. He knew I had it. She led him to the small table where they had sat nights before. With trembling fingers, she pulled out a faded, salt-stained photograph. It showed a man with a kind, wide smile standing in front of a massive shipping crane. Behind him, the logo of Park Group Logistics was clearly visible, but it was the background that made Tiang's blood turn to ice. It was the Busan shipping port, specifically Warehouse 7. My father, Amara said, her voice thick with a grief that mirrored his own. He was a foreman at your port in Busan. He died 6 years ago. They told me it was an industrial accident, a gas leak that caused an explosion. Tiang's breath hitched. He remembered that night. It was the same night as the gala. The same night the rain had turned red. He had been told the warehouse explosion was a freak accident, a distraction that the police used to explain away the gunfire in the streets. I didn't come to Seoul because I wanted a job in a mansion, Tiang, Amara confessed, her eyes finally filling with tears as she looked at the photo. I came because I found this in his old locker. He had written a note on the back. He was scared. He said he saw Director Choi meeting with the Kims at that warehouse. He said they were moving something that wasn't cargo. He died an hour after he wrote it. Tiang took the photo, his thumb brushing over the image of the man who looked so much like the woman standing before him. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. The explosion hadn't been an accident, and the shooting hadn't been a random act of violence. They were two halves of the same betrayal. Choi had cleared the witnesses at the port and attempted to clear the boss in the city on the same horrific night. He looked from the photo to Amara, the girl who had spent 3 years on an island nursing a secret, only to end up in the house of the man she thought might be responsible. He realized the depth of her courage, to walk into the lion's den not just to heal the lion, but to find the truth about the thorns in his paw. You've been carrying this alone, Tiang murmured, his voice thick with a new kind of pain. I thought you were the one who ordered it, she admitted, a single tear escaping. Until I met you, until I saw the way you couldn't sleep. A man who orders murders like that doesn't lose his rest over a ghost. He loses his rest because he loved the ghost too much. Tiang pulled her into a sudden, fierce embrace, burying his face in the crook of her neck. The shadows had converged, and the truth was finally standing in the light. The man who had saved his life with a cup of tea was the daughter of the man his empire had failed to protect. As the sirens wailed in the distance and the city of Seoul began to stir, Tiang Park felt the last of the silent dragon die away. In its place was something much more dangerous. A man who finally knew exactly who to kill and exactly who he had to live for. The secret was out, and for Director Choi, the real nightmare was just beginning. The city of Seoul was a tapestry of blurring neon and wet asphalt as Tiang's armored sedan tore through the veins of Gangnam. He was no longer the man who sat paralyzed by a digital clock. He was a force of nature restored to its most lethal form. In the passenger seat, his knuckles were white as he gripped the door handle, his jaw set in a line of terrifying resolve. Behind them, 2 black SUVs filled with his most loyal men trailed like hounds on a scent. Director Choi had fled the moment the hit on the mansion failed, but in the digital kingdom Tiang built, there were no dark corners left. They had tracked Choi's signal to the industrial outskirts near the Incheon docks, a place where the wind tasted of salt and the secrets were buried in rusted shipping containers. Pursuit was a symphony of screeching tires and roaring engines. Choi's getaway car, a silver sports coupe, darted through the early morning traffic with the desperation of a cornered rat. Tiang didn't shout orders over the radio. He didn't need to. His driver knew the stakes. When they reached the long, desolate stretch of the harbor road, Tiang leaned forward, his voice a low, vibrating growl. "Ram him!" The heavy sedan surged forward, the reinforced bumper slamming into the coupe's rear quarter panel. The silver car spun out of control, a chaotic whirl of metal and sparks, before crashing into a stack of empty pallets near the water's edge. Tiang was out of the car before the smoke had even cleared from the wreck. He didn't wait for his guards. He moved through the swirling mist of the harbor, his long coat billowing behind him like the wings of a dark omen. Director Choi was crawling from the wreckage, blood trickling down his forehead, his breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. He reached for a fallen handgun, but Tiang's boot came down on his wrist with a sickening crunch. The scream that tore from Choi's throat was lost to the crashing of the waves against the pier. 6 years, Choi, Tiang whispered, his voice carrying over the wind with a chilling clarity. He reached down, grabbing the traitor by the collar and hoisting him up against the cold steel of a shipping container. "I gave you my trust. I gave you my empire to manage while I drowned in the silence you created. Why?" Choi laughed, a wet, rattling sound that ended in a cough of blood. "Because you were soft, Tiang. You and that woman. You were turning the park group into a charity. You wanted to close the Busan roots. You wanted to go clean for her. The Kims offered me a future where we stayed kings. I didn't just want the money, I wanted a boss who wasn't a poet." Tiang's grip tightened, his eyes flashing with a predatory fire. "The explosion at the port, Amara's father, you cleared the witnesses." "I cleared the garbage," Choi spat, his bravado returning in the face of death. "And that night at the gala, I didn't hire a sniper, Tiang. I wanted to see the look on your face. I was the one in the shadows. I was the one who pulled the trigger. I aimed for you, but that little doll of yours, she was faster than I expected. She died for a man who didn't even have the heart to kill his own enemies." The world seemed to go silent at that confession. The phantom gunshot that had haunted Tiang for 2,190 days suddenly had a face. The monster was no longer a memory. It was the man trembling in his grasp. Tiang's vision blurred with a red, suffocating rage. He pulled back his fist, the urge to tear Choi apart with his bare hands vibrating through his entire body. He wanted to feel the traitor's life flicker out under his fingers. He wanted to drown him in the very harbor where he had murdered Amara's father. But as he looked into Choi's terrified eyes, he heard a soft, melodic humming in the back of his mind. He smelled the scent of Jeju herbs and honey. He felt the warmth of Amara's hand resting near his arm in the kitchen. "Dangerous men don't carry that much sadness," she had said. If he killed Choi here, in the dark, in an act of blind, visceral rage, he would be becoming the monster Choi wanted him to be. He would be betraying the man Soo-jin had died to protect. He would be returning to a world where sleep was impossible because the blood on his hands never dried. Slowly, with a control that cost him more than any battle he had ever fought, Tiang lowered his hand. He didn't let go of Choi's collar, but the fire in his eyes cooled into something much more terrifying. A calculated, absolute justice. "Death is too quiet for you, Choi," Tiang said, his voice dropping to a level that made the traitor's blood run cold. "You want to be a king? I'm going to make sure you spend the rest of your life in a place where no one knows your name. I'm going to strip you of everyone, every connection, and every memory of power. You'll live in a cell, listening to the silence. Just like I did, but unlike me, you'll never have a light to guide you out." Tiang shoved Choi toward his waiting men. "Take him. Hand him over to the prosecutor's office with the Busan files. Every shipment, every bribe, every body he buried. I want him to watch his world crumble from a cage." As his men dragged the screaming traitor toward the SUVs, Tiang stood alone on the pier. He looked out over the dark water of the Incheon harbor, the first light of dawn beginning to gray the horizon. The weight on his chest hadn't vanished, but it had shifted. He had chosen the path of the man over the path of the dragon. He turned back toward his car, his thoughts already racing toward the mansion, toward the girl who was waiting in the kitchen. For the first time in 6 years, he wasn't running from the past. He was walking toward a future where the 12:30 mark was no longer a deadline for his soul, but just another minute in a life worth living. He had broken the cycle of blood, and as he closed the car door, he realized he wasn't just a boss who had survived. He was a man who had finally earned his rest. The sun over Seoul did not rise with the jagged, threatening glare of previous years. Instead, it washed over the Han River in a soft, liquid gold, spilling through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse like a long-awaited blessing. Inside the master suite, the digital clock on the nightstand ticked silently over to 8:00 a.m. for the first time in over 2,000 mornings. The man in the bed did not recoil from the light. Tiong Park lay perfectly still, his body sinking deep into the luxury of the mattress, his muscles heavy with the profound, restorative weight of actual sleep. There had been no phantom gunshot at midnight. There had been no cold sweat or gasping for air. The nightmare, which had once seemed like an eternal sentence, had finally broken like a fever. He opened his eyes slowly, blinking against the brightness. The room was the same, the white marble, the gold leaf trim, the expensive silence, but the atmosphere had shifted. The air no longer felt like it was made of static and grief. He sat up, stretching his limbs, and felt a strange, almost dizzying lightness in his chest. He was no longer a prisoner of a single minute in time. The 12:30 a.m. ghost had been replaced by the truth, and the truth had finally allowed him to leave the sidewalk where Sujin died. He was alive, and for the first time, he didn't feel guilty about the air in his lungs. Tiong moved through the mansion with a quiet, unhurried pace. He passed the staff in the hallway, and this time, they didn't flatten themselves against the walls in terror. They saw a man in a rumpled silk robe, his hair messy and his eyes clear, and they offered tentative, genuine bows. In the kitchen, the scent of Jeju herbs had been replaced by the rich, grounding aroma of fresh coffee and toasted bread. Amara was there, standing by the window, the morning light catching the deep brown of her skin and the peaceful set of her shoulders. She turned as he entered, and the smile she gave him was not one of a servant to a master, but of a companion who had survived the storm alongside him. "You slept," she said, her voice a warm resonance that anchored him to the present. "I slept," he repeated, the words feeling like a miracle on his tongue. He walked over to her, standing at the window, looking out at the sprawling city he had ruled through fear for so long. "I didn't think it was possible to feel this quiet." Later that evening, as the neon lights of Seoul began to flicker to life, Tiong and Amara stood together on the wide, glass-walled balcony. The silent dragon was gone. In his place stood a man who had traded his iron mask for a weary, honest handsomeness. He was still powerful, still the head of an empire, but the foundation of that empire had changed. The files he had handed to the prosecutors would dismantle the rot Choi had created, and while the underworld would always have its shadows, Tiong was no longer interested in being their king. He reached out, his hand finding Amara's on the railing. Her fingers were warm, a constant reminder of the life he had almost let slip away. "You reminded me that I was worth protecting," he murmured, looking at the horizon. "Not because of the name, but because of the man." Amara squeezed his hand, her gaze fixed on the rising moon. "The man is much more interesting than the legend, Tiong, and a man who can sleep is a man who can finally begin to dream." They stood in the soft twilight, a portrait of healing in a city of stone. For the first time in 6 years, Tiong Park allowed himself to think about the future, not as a series of tactical moves and defensive perimeters, but as a journey. He was a man who had been pulled from the wreckage of his own soul, and as he looked at the girl beside him, he knew the dawn was just the beginning. But far below, at the iron-wrought gates of the mansion, the peace of the evening was punctuated by a different kind of silence. A sleek, obsidian-black sedan sat idling in the shadows of the street lamps, its engine a low, predatory hum. The windows were tinted dark, reflecting the neon chaos of the city. Inside, a gloved hand adjusted the rearview mirror, catching the faint, distant glow of the penthouse balcony high above. The dragon had fallen asleep, and while he had found his peace, the vacuum he left behind was already being felt. A new era of the Seoul underground was stirring in the dark, and as the sedan slowly pulled away into the night, it left behind a single, chilling message. Peace is a beautiful dream, but in the world of the Mafia, the morning always brings a new war. The real story had only just begun. Tiong chose justice over revenge, but the shadows at the gate prove he isn't safe yet. Do you think Amara is the key to his survival, or his greatest weakness? Let me know your theories in the comments. If you want to see more of Tiong and Amara's journey through the underworld of Seoul, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. We're just scratching the surface of the silent dragon's empire. Justice was served at the harbor, but a new shadow has reached the gates. The nightmare is over. The reality is just starting. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next part.